Subproject 23. Project Entryway. Derivative of the Montauk Project. And an absolute horror show. My name's Joshua A. Jameson, and I was part of the United States Air Force from 1978 to 1998. I spent the first third of my service as a pararescueman, and that much I'm proud of. The other 2/3 is eating me away inside. Now, for starters, I'm going to let you know that I'm going to avoid filler, and bullshit. I will, however, provide you with what little evidence I've retained over the years. Skip over it if you want. The truth remains the same. I've noticed that the infamous Montauk Project has gotten a little more notoriety over the past few years, and most of us have heard the story by now. Military scientists kidnapped children and exposed them to torture, all to try and unlock innate abilities. Most notably, the ability to conjure something up out of nothing. The sister project of Montauk, Project Entryway, has stayed silent even over the growing years. I won't let that stand any longer. Us at Project Entryway followed a similar direction as Montauk, with the only major difference being that we weren't trying to make something new. We were trying to find something already here, while the geeks at Montauk try to conjure up faces and monsters using their minds. We were trying to explore the unexplored. I can't tell you how the scientists got involved. Mostly just folks from Brookhaven Laboratory, I'd guess. But I joined up when I heard about the long-term Joint Forces mission needing volunteers to form medical and security details. Well, as a pararescueman, I had both. So I applied to the job posting, and I submitted my resume and hoped for the best. I got the job. Soon enough, I was being flown down to New York with 3 other security guys and being ushered down to Camp Hero. At this time, no one really knew about Montauk. The internet was in its baby phase, and the fear from the Cold War left the information, what was available, double encrypted and ciphered. As far as we were aware, Camp Hero was just another radio site. After our landing and a bit of a drive, we hit Montauk Point, New York. We passed through the small friendly-looking town and through some forest before reaching a small gated military outpost. The only thing of note was a large radio tower, which we all expected from our research. Our driver pulled up to a security checkpoint, and all of our gear was confiscated. I'd assume they'd search it and give it back to us. But instead, they just threw it in some vault, and I never saw any of it again. To make up for our stolen gear, they gave us brand new uniforms along with whatever else we needed. Me and the rest of the security boys weren't used to this kind of treatment. It was just too clinical for the usually sarcastic and snide security police members we were used to. Our whole conversation consisted of this. They'd ask a question, we'd answer. They'd ask if we needed anything. We'd say no, and then silence. I'm not sure if the boys we interacted with knew what was going on the inside of the facility, but they sure as hell didn't try to make friends with us. Given enough time, we were geared up and ready to go. The captain in charge of in-processing told us our debrief would be the first thing that following morning, and for us to try and get some rest if we could. That's when a few uniformed men escorted us across the field and into the radio tower. When we entered the facility, we walked right by the communication center, staffed by only a handful of men, and down a tight hallway. We found ourselves facing a large concrete door. A few guards nearby pushed it open, exposing a flight of stairs leading straight downwards. Wherever we were going had to be in the bowels of the earth. The stairs seemed to continuously descend. Our walk down took whatever courage we had. There was a certain electricity in the air that was unnatural. It didn't feel like you were being watched. It felt like you were alone. I think we all took a deep breath of stale air when we hit the bottom of that staircase. What lay in front of us now was a hub of hallways and doorways. People in lab coats were walking around, conversing and eyeing us, We were guided over to our living quarters, separate from Montauk security members of course, and we were once again instructed to get some rest. Now, one thing you should know about military members, no matter what branch, we're all just kids. We talk, we gossip, we're inappropriate, and when you leave us to ourselves, we do the opposite of what you want. We were told to sleep, therefore, we were told to chat each other up like giddy school children. It was then that I got to know everyone. There was Bobby Wilkerson, former speech champion from Washington State. Then there was Georgie Caparelli, all-star college baseball player from Jersey. And of course, Tanaka Yoshida, a child of Japanese soldiers during World War II, and the biggest American patriot I knew. Why did I tell you their names? Because they deserve to be remembered. They were good people who just wanted to do the best they could out in the world. Each had dreams. They all wanted to be something when they left the service. Bobby wanted to be a congressman. Georgie wanted to work for his father at their lumber mill. And Yoshida just wanted to retire as a United States serviceman with full honors. That's it. That's all they wanted. After a brief yet giddy exchange of words, we managed to get what little sleep we could. One thing I remember about sleeping down there, once the lights went out, that place was darker than dark. We were God knows how many feet on the ground, and there was absolutely zero natural lighting. Once the man-made lights were out, all lights were out. After an undetermined amount of time, morning must have hit. We were all woken up by a scraggly-looking and frail scientist. He introduced himself as Dr. Grant Hargrove and asked us to follow him to the experiment area. We walked down the maze-like corridors, passing by all sorts of men from all different backgrounds. Some seemed disheveled, while others seemed to stare off into space. Besides from a few whispers between each other, this facility was dead quiet around us. After a couple of minutes of walking, we reached our destination. A big metal door with black paint reading Sub-Project 23 in blocky letters. Dr. Hargrove turned towards us and began his speech. Inside these doors is where you'll spend most of your time. We don't have much funding, so the four of you will have to do for security. You can work the details of that on your own, as long as we have 2 armed members inside of the room at any given time while our experiment is running. You are to take the title of Squadron 0823. At these words, we glanced at each other. 4 members certainly didn't make a squadron. At our glances, we heard Hargrove make a grunt before continuing. Yes, I'm well aware there are only 4 of you. It's just to provide leeway in case members need to be exchanged or replaced in a timely manner. If you have any questions, you may ask them to me or one of the other scientists involved in Sub-Project 23. You won't speak a word about what we're doing to anyone, including the other workers down here. Understood? His tone was matter-of-fact and rehearsed. Who knows how many times he told this briefing, and who knows what happened to the others that were working down here before us. I had always hoped we were the first, but something tells me we weren't. We choked down our questions, and in unison answered, Understood. He turned his back to us and typed in some numbers into a small keypad next to the door. We heard several clicks as the locks disengaged. Hargrove opened up the door for us, and we stepped inside. The room was a massive concrete rectangle. The ceilings had to have been as tall as a small auditorium. The only structure inside this facility were right next to us, a set of steps leading to an observation post. A door, similar to the one we entered from, stood strong at the top of the step. The steps themselves seemed to be nothing more than a glorified rolling step ladder. There was indents in the concrete floor, allowing the stairs to be pushed away from the observation door. Strange, I remember thinking to myself. We're dozens of feet underground in a highly fortified facility. What good could these extra safety measures be in place for? I heard Dr. Hargrove cough to himself to gather our attention. Each of these doors are installed with 7 magnetic locks, 4 divided on the top and bottom, and 3 on the side. They can withstand about 1,500 pounds of force each, and can only be disabled with the code of the day. The codes will change daily, so make sure you check the locks in the observation room up those stairs. He lifted his frail-looking arms towards the observation deck. Sir, what will be our daily duties? I heard Bobby's soft voice ask. The doctor tried to give a warm smile towards Bobby, but it seemed pained and forced. Hopefully, all you'll have to do is sit down in front of some machinery and let us scientists do our work. If something happens to us, you may have to provide security or search and rescue operations. We all looked at each other, then back to the nearly empty warehouse. The only thing standing out in the barren room was some metallic pillars and beams aligned at the opposite side of the room from the observation deck. Wires ran from the pillars straight into the concrete of the nearby walls. Search and rescue? As in here? In this room? Georgie's loud Italian voice echoed in the concrete shell we found ourselves in. Dr. Hargrove's gaze turned behind us, his eyes defocusing and forming into thought. In a way, he muttered quietly, more to himself than to us. Before he could clarify, the door to the observation room clicked open, giving a loud moan as the metal fought against the arms of whoever was pushing. Jesus, I get these doors, but really? A voice rattled off from behind the door as it opened, eventually revealing a man of good stature. He looked like one of us, a serviceman. Rather than a scientist though, his lab coat expressed something different. Hey everyone, sorry for interrupting. My name's Dr. Carter, and I'm the exploratory scientist of this project. He gave a charming smile before nodding towards Hargrove. I overheard Dr. Hargrove mentioning saving one of us. That will most likely mean me. In case something happens, I just want to say, I'm appreciative of you guys. I know you're in the dark right now, but we're going to be doing some exciting things down here. Dr. Carter flashed another smile, exposing his pearly white teeth. Dr. Carter was clearly more of a person people than Dr. Hargrove. Just behind him stood a half a dozen other scientists, writing things on clipboards, pulling levers and activating switches. It was such a large room, yet the only space that seemed to be in use was the observation room. I could feel my hair stand up as a feeling of apprehension came over me. Something was off here. I was just a normal kid for the time we were in. I never much watched science fiction movies or shows. I never believed in the boogeyman, and I believed the wireless phones were the work of the devil. What I was seeing made me double think all of that. Well, except maybe the devil part. So, Dr. Hargrove, if you wouldn't mind stepping up here and taking control, I'm going to introduce these guys to Project Entryway. Dr. Carter eagerly headed down the metal stairs, skipping a few steps here and there. Oh, you guys are going to love this. He waved his arms at us, beckoning for us to follow. Dr. Carter took us nearly all the way to the other side of the facility, before stopping and turning around. I saw his eyes meet with Hargrove's in the operations center. Carter lifted his hand and gave a thumbs up to Hargrove. You guys might want to close your eyes and open them when I tell you to. Most people faint after seeing this their first time. Brains can't process it much, but exposure helps. I saw Georgie cover his eyes with his hands and turning around, heeding the doctor's advice. Oh fuck this, Georgie muttered under his breath while shaking his head. Bobby, Yoshi and myself all decided to keep our eyes on the empty concrete wall in front of us. Within just a few moments, we heard the whirling mechanical sounds of machinery coming to life from the metallic pillars jutting out of the floor. Before we knew it, something appeared in front of us. Or rather, stopped appearing. The back wall completely disappeared into a thick and syrupy black shadow. It seemed to give out a pulse that made our bodies react in the worst way. It felt like whatever this thing This shadow had the power to radiate the symptoms of vertigo. Each pulse sent a wave through our brains that told us to look away. I saw Yoshi and Bobby both fall to their knees beside me. Bobby had buried his head into his lap and covered his ears, trying to stop the pulsing from getting into his mind. Based on how he was acting, I don't think it helped. This wall is now a door, gentlemen. A gateway to another plane of existence. If you haven't already viewed it, then please look. Georgie uncovered his face and turned around. Immediately, his face turned a pale and sickly color. We've run test after test to get this right. We brought you in because we're finally ready to send a person through. That be me. Dr. Carter stood in front of us with a wide grin on his childish face. His back was towards the pulsating black void behind him. I couldn't help it anymore. I threw up. We all exited our meeting that day without a word between us. We received our mission statements and were told the testing will begin next afternoon after a morning of calibrations. We had off until then. It wasn't until we entered the chow hall that one of us spoke up. What the fuck did we sign up for? Georgie mumbled angrily to his food. I don't know, man, but just stay positive. Maybe it's not as strange as we think it is, Bobby replied, trying to reassure our little group. Not as strange? A fucking wall disappeared. Fucking gone. And what took its place? Goddamned. Yoshi cut him off as his voice was starting to rise in anger. Remember what they said. No talking about it unless we're in that room. Georgie listened to Yoshi and quieted himself down, shaking his head in disbelief. I had nothing to add to the topic. I still felt sick, and my head wouldn't stop pounding. I dreaded the morning. Sadly, as much as you dread something, it doesn't stop it from coming. We were woken up a little later than usual as the science crew did their calculating. It didn't help much. I think we were all still shaken up about what we saw the day prior. In light of that, we all agreed that each of us would sit in to see what was going to happen that morning. We grabbed our weapons from the armory and headed to the project room. Once inside, we saw nearly 3 times the previous staff walking back and forth. They must have had the whole project science division prepared and prepped for what was about to happen. We took some seats near the observation room staircase and watched the men work from afar. Amidst all the lab coats running back and forth, we saw a man who looked like he came straight from the moon. He had heavily padded and sealed off clothing with a white visor. There's no way to describe him. He looked like an astronaut. The rest of the crew did function tests on his gear, checking the pressure levels and making sure he could see properly through the visor. A few lab techs dragged out a large piece of machinery with a large bundle of wires and tubes attached. They hooked up a large tube to the man using a fist-sized opening at the small of his back. At this point, I could safely assume that the individual inside the suit was Dr. Carter. I didn't envy him for what he was about to do. I did, however, notice the 4 other suits similar to his stacked up on some crates near the far side of the wall. I knew those would be ours if something happened to the doctor. All the prep work took upwards of an hour. They were trying to make everything as suitable as possible for what they were about to do. Soon enough, the scientists backed away from Dr. Carter and joined us on the opposite side of the room. Their expressions ranged from giddy to frightened. I don't know what tests they ran before this, but no one knew what to expect. I heard an exchange between the scientists while we were waiting for the next step. It's a 10-minute trial, right? No exploration today? Just making sure the device works? I saw the other gentleman nod his head. The room fell silent as Dr. Carter turned around and faced the operations room. He gave the thumbs-up signal and turned to face the far wall. Everyone watched intensely as the machines whirled to life, casting away the matter that made up the wall and exposing the void underneath. Over the intercoms in the room, we heard Dr. Carter's voice.
Testing. Can you hear me? That's affirmed, Dr. Carter. We're good to go with the test run.
Dr. Hargrove's emotionless voice rang out over the loudspeakers. He walked towards the void until his face was inches from it.
Should I say something important or memorable?
Carter's voice jokingly said over the speakers. You could hear the fear he was trying so hard to cover up.
It'll be okay, Carter. We have security standing by.
Hargrove's voice responded. I felt my body tense up, realizing that he was referring to us.
Well, how about our mission motto then? Damnant quod non intellegunt. Hopefully that thing's true, and we have nothing to fear.
He gave a slight chuckle to himself, before quickly stepping into the void. The instant he disappeared from our view, the loudspeakers exploded with sound. A high-pitched screeching poured over us, sending some lab technicians to the ground, covering their ears. My team and I stood up in reflex, aiming our rifles down to the portal. Just then, the sound abruptly stopped, and a figure emerged from the inky blackness. The thing was big, with a single large eye reflecting the room like a predator's in the night. I could feel the tip of my finger tighten around the trigger before I realized what it was. It was Dr. Carter. Less than 1 second after stepping through the portal, he emerged back. Hold! One friendly stepping out! I called out to my team. Each lowered their rifles at my words.
Oh, thank God. I thought something happened to all of you.
Carter called out over the intercoms.
I talked for 10 minutes straight and got no response.
The technicians all ran to help the doctor take off his suit and take vitals. There was an odd red powder over his uniform. They tossed each article of gear he had into a hefty plastic bag and tossed them aside. His brow was drenched in sweat and he was breathing heavily.
We need lighter suits,
he said while gasping for air. I looked up to the observation deck and saw Dr. Hargrove and his team quickly going over notes and handling some machinery. Soon after, Hargrove reached for his microphone.
Carter, all your transmissions came back within a second. All 10 minutes of it. Were you really on the other side for the full time?
Dr. Carter reached for a microphone of one of the techs and spoke.
Sure as hell was. It's different over there. I counted my time and came back when I hit 10 minutes in. I guess we didn't factor in possible time discrepancies. It's going to make things harder for communications.
Hargrove and his team upstairs talked for a few minutes before returning to the microphone.
Communications are going to have to be one way then. But you can't speed ours out before it gets to you. Next test, we'll try the one-way communications. But give us a report on what you saw.
Carter arched his back, trying to crack his fatigued bones while doctors took his blood.
We definitely found a new place. I didn't explore very far, but I did note that I saw what looked like a city skyline not too far ahead. Maybe an hour's walk or two. The gear had the same weight as well, so no distribution of gravity.
As Carter was recalling what he experienced, Dr. Hargrove rapidly took notes.
Also I heard, I don't know how else to phrase it, moans off near the cityscape? Hundreds of beings maybe. I couldn't tell if they were in pain or not, but it definitely was some sort of moaning or screaming.
He took a pause and added,
I can't be sure, but I think I might have also seen some things walking around. Explain.
Dr. Hargrove called out over the intercom.
Well, they were far at first. Human-shaped. Maybe a little taller than a person. They seemed to see me, but I couldn't make out any features on them. They were far away across the sands, and all I could see was blackness. They looked like they were made of the same material as the gateway.
Carter stopped to catch his breath before returning to his story.
They were getting closer the longer I was there. Had to have been a few at the start, but by the time I came back through it, it was closer to 12.5. They didn't seem to walk. Just kind of, I don't know, got closer. Collided, maybe. Did you feel threatened by them? No. At first, it seemed like they were just observing. I'm not sure if they wanted to make contact with me or what. But they didn't feel right. They aren't like you and me. They just are.
His voice faltered for a split second.
Like I said, I couldn't see them that well, so maybe I'm overthinking it. But they seem like standing shadows that had some sort of mass to them.
Carter's voice finally trailed off. Even from our distance, I could see he was shivering.
Understood. Debrief with me in private. We're shutting the gate down for today. Everyone's dismissed.
My team headed back to our room. We were all a little uneasy by what the doctor described. Given enough time, our unease became the norm. The next few tests were more trial runs. Much of the same happened. Dark figures in the distance, moans from the city, and audio issues. Eventually, they worked out that last part though. They slowed down the recordings in real time so we can hear everything that Dr. Carter says. Though, it's odd to say the least to watch him step back through the gate with his voice still echoing over the loudspeakers like he was still out there. With the audio fixed, Phase 2 started. Exploration. We were woken up that morning with the knowledge that something new was going to happen. What that entailed, none of us knew. That day was starting a little earlier than most. My team and I were told to be ready by mid-afternoon. Up until then, we could sleep in or get some chow. We spent that free time choking down some food and pondering in silence. Today was the big day. Exploration Day. The test was scheduled to be the longest by far, totaling an astounding 36 seconds on our side and 6 hours on Carter's. That allowed for him to travel 2 hours to the city, 2 hours to account for the exploration and possible fatigue he might have, and the final 2 hours to make it back home safely. It definitely was going to be a rough day for Dr. Carter, regardless of the outcome. Luckily, it looked like he was more than ready. When we entered the facility that afternoon, we were greeted by a now familiar sight. Lab coats of doctors and technicians blowing about as the people wearing them rushed from place to place. Having nothing to offer at this point, we took our seats near the observation deck and listened to the conversations of the eggheads in front of us. That's when I overheard something that still haunts me. Up until now, I thought of the gateway as being a portal to another world, somewhere far away. I had imagined that the things Dr. Carter had encountered were billions of light years away. I guess I was wrong. Is there any way something from over there could get to us? A lab tech asked one of the scientists, jotting down notes. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. That whole place inhabits the same space we do. It's just blocked off from us. Theoretically, if we can interact with them, that means they could interact with us. Or perhaps we're on a higher plane of existence, in which case we can affect them, but they can't affect us. And what if neither of us are natives of that place? You said yourself that this dimension of space was the easiest to program into. What if something else programmed into it as well? The scientist put down his pencil and gave a half-hearted chuckle. Well, then the odds there were from a higher plane of existence drastically falls apart. I thought about what that meant. I still do. Everything Dr. Carter saw while on the other side was somehow around us, occupying the same space. When he stepped through that portal, he was still technically here. Just also not. Something about that, about the fact it was right there, right next to us, scared the shit out of me.
Dr. Carter, are you ready?
Hargrove's voice echoed out around us. The mass of lab coats filling the center of the room dispersed, leaving only Carter and his suit visible.
Hey, you know me, Hargrove.
Dr. Carter's voice replied, sounding chipper than usual.
Can I get that in a yes or no statement, please?
Hargrove gave a hint of a smirk as he stood in the observation room, clipboard in hand.
For you, anything.
A few of the scientists gave a slight chuckle at Carter's difficult nature. The doctor then patted down his suit, looking for any flaws.
Everything seems good on my end. Pressure is still golden, and audio seems to be operational. Want to get the timer down here?
I looked up to Hargrove as he said something to one of his assistants. The young tech then ran out of the door, carrying a large tripod with a thick television-sized screen on top of it. The assistant brought the device midway between the observation deck and the metallic pillars. He grabbed the cord and plugged the machine into one of the nearby walls. As soon as it had power, it showed the numbers, 36 seconds. For 36 seconds, Carter would be gone. In those seconds, he'd make a 6-hour journey into a city and make it all the way back home safely.
Well, are we good to go?
Carter asked while looking up at the observation deck. Hargrove nodded in response and began to flip some nearby switches. The familiar buzz coming out of the pillars resonated inside the concrete box. We watched as the wall fell away into the familiar void once more.
Wish me luck, boys.
He turned around to face the gateway before glancing back at us.
Please get me back if something happens. I'm counting on you guys.
We nodded in response. Our faces didn't show it, but I can vouch for us all when I say our hearts were pounding against our chests.
36 seconds.
He muttered and gulped down as he stepped through the portal. Hargrove's assistant hit the button on the counter, and the half-a-minute wait started.
I hope you guys can hear me. By this time, it's probably been a fraction of a second for you, but I've begun my walk towards the city.
27 seconds.
The Shadow Men are still here, still far away, but they're facing me.
19 seconds.
I can already tell we need to work on these suits. Jesus, is this going to be a long walk?
12 seconds.
Should be pretty close to the time I get back on. Lucky future me.
4 seconds. At this point, you could see the sweat pouring down from our foreheads. 4 seconds meant 40 minutes for Carter. Plenty of time for him to make it back. But seeing the single-digit countdown of the timer brought a sense of paranoia with it. A loud, resonating beep came over the loudspeakers as the clock hit 0. As a precaution, we were to gear up immediately in case of emergency. My team quickly got up out of our seats and rushed over to the supply area. Lab techs were already standing by with our suits ready to go. As soon as we made it to the gear, a slight suckling noise came from the portal. All of us turned our heads and faced the gateway. Standing dead center in the void was all the gear that made up Carter. He slowly crept forward, his feet dragging slightly under the weight of his suit. He looked like he was in pain. "Go, quickly! Get his gear off and give him some air," I called out to the techs standing near our equipment. They looked shocked at me. They weren't used to being bossed around by the security. Luckily, they noted the urgency in my tone and ran over to help. Carter fell hard down on the concrete floor. A loud muffled slam came from underneath him. Both the doctors and their assistants quickly rushed over. Me and the rest of the guys traded glances. I had some medical experience, but nothing like the other doctors around us. My experience just wasn't as good as theirs. I heard them undoing the straps around his face mask before ripping it off. From my position, all I could see was several men falling over backwards with horrified looks on their faces. I quickly ran over to see what was happening, only to discover an empty faceplate. As they took off more and more of Carter's gear, they discovered less and less. Carter wasn't inside. Nothing was. "Gear up," I called out to my crew. Dr. Carter was missing, and it was our job to find him. Our supply guys rushed back and began to help us put on our gear. It took us around 10 minutes to get completely outfitted. That meant Dr. Carter was already missing on his end for close to 4 days. His voice, however, was still ringing out over the intercoms, talking about nothing more than his walk towards the city. It felt like a ghost was talking to us. Hargrove's voice came over the loudspeakers with a venomous tone.
Your primary objective at this point is to find Dr. Carter's visual recordings. Secondary priority is to find his person. Do you understand? As soon as you find his recordings, you bring it back.
Visual recordings? I remember mumbling to myself. And then it hit me. After every debrief, Carter would have a private meeting with Hargrove. These meetings must have been a showcase of the visual recordings Carter obtained. They had us in our uniforms instead of prepped and ready in the suits. The longer it took us to gear up left a larger chance that whatever got Carter had moved on, leaving the evidence behind. Dr. Carter had to have known our main priority wouldn't be to save him. That's why he asked us personally to search for him and bring him back. Hargrove only cared about his pet project, not about anyone involved. It was at this point I could feel my hands clench up into fists. If I wasn't already working against the clock, I might have said or done something stupid. I looked over at my team and nodded at them, watching each of their reflective helmets do the same. It was time to begin our true mission. We approached the gateway. It looked different up close, and it was hard to focus your eyes on it. Every millimeter of the dark matter seemed to explode outward, then contract back in. The void was in a constant and eternal motion. When we approached the gate, the tar it was made of seemed to reach out just a little bit further, as if trying to reach us to pull us inside of it. I bit back my urge to turn and run from this godforsaken mission, and so did my team. Without another word, we stepped inside. Dr. Carter never revealed the feeling you get when you step into the gateway. My body felt like it was transforming, like a horrible growth pain. I felt my skin being pulled and tugged while simultaneously being pushed away from my body. The feeling only lasted for a few seconds before we all appeared on the other side of the gateway. In front of us stood the reddened flatland that we all had imagined during the last few weeks. It was exactly like we pictured. A flatland covered in a red sand that the wind would kick up every few seconds. I glanced around and saw the massive portal behind us. It looked the same on this end that it did on the other. A pulsating, incomprehensible mess.
Hey, do you hear that?
Georgie called out over to us. I listened closely and heard what he was talking about. Moans and bellows coming from a very long ways away.
That must be the sound Dr. Carter was talking about. It doesn't sound right.
Bobby chimed in. He was right. It didn't sound like someone with a broken bone or fracture, nor did it sound like a melancholy drawl. It sounded very much alive and visceral.
Guess we should head towards it, huh? I think I can see the skyline coming from that direction.
I peered through the sand gusts and looked closely. Very vaguely I could see what looked like massive towers jutting out of the ground, spiraling up towards the reddening sky. They looked unfinished. The shadows of scaffolding could clearly be seen looming over the tops of their unfinished roofs. I looked around once more and saw nothing else. I didn't like that one bit. Every single time Carter went through, he described a shadow man watching him. Yet, we were all out here alone.
Let's move.
Yoshi instructed, and I nodded in agreement.
The sooner we head towards the city, the sooner we can get back home.
So, our walk began. I'd like to say we saw things out there. Other buildings, people, creatures. But the fact is, we saw nothing other than the ever-growing city in front of us. The towers we once squinted to see grew clearer, as did the buildings below them. The sounds of the hundreds, if not thousands of things grew louder, making communication more difficult between us. We were about 10 minutes outside the city before our feet hit pavement. There was a long road hiding underneath the red dust of the land that reached straight into the city. When a strong gust of wind took hold, the dust would shift, exposing vehicle light reflectors and white lines. I felt a chill run up my spine as I thought back to what the scientists said. We were still on Earth. We just weren't in our usual spot. I pushed those feelings aside and pressed forward. As we neared the first building on our walk, I noticed the material it was made of. Glass, stone, brick, everything we'd use back home. Yet, I saw nothing on our whole walk that could constitute where they got these materials from. I reached out to feel the building under my gloved hand, but a voice startled me back to reality.
Holy shit.
Georgie called out. Our heads followed his gaze. Ahead of us, a few dozen meters down the road, was one of the shadow men Carter had mentioned. Whatever this thing was, it didn't seem to belong here. The being's body had begun to pulsate and shake furiously. It seemed like it was made from a less stable version of our gateway. Eventually, it stretched itself out thin, quickly becoming more translucent, before vanishing before our eyes.
Fuck, man. What the fuck was that? I don't like this.
Bobby whispered softly, his voice creaking under his anxiety.
Where do we even begin to look?
Yoshi asked directly to me, obviously trying to maintain mission focus.
Well, if I was stuck outside that portal all day and could only see the skyline of this place, I'd probably go to the biggest tower I saw.
The others glanced forward. A few miles ahead was the largest skyscraper in the city.
Let's head out then.
Bobby said as he gripped the rifle in his hand tighter. We walked down the barren streets, surrounded by nothing but screaming. It was clear they were coming from inside each building, but curiosity or not, I would never willingly lead my men into unnecessary danger just to explore.
One cut is all it takes.
A voice whispered.
Did you guys say something?
I asked out. I knew I heard something underneath all the howling voices around us. My team all shook their heads and pressed on.
Can you see us? Stop walking. I know I heard something.
I barked out as I began to look around. Are you dreaming yet? That time, I heard it straight in my ear. No, not on the outside of my suit, but in there, with me. I could almost feel their breath wrap around my face. I pulled my rifle up and aimed it towards the voice. I saw my team raise their weapons up with me. I don't know if they heard what I did, but they stood by me.
Jameson, by your feet.
Bobby said as he quickly got on a knee and began surveying the area. I looked down and froze. On the red sands below me lay footprints, long talon-like claws. They had been following us since we entered the city, and none of us had noticed. What made things worse is they were facing towards me, circling my body every step of the way. I felt my body begin to grow weak. I heard a shot ring out from Georgie. I looked over and saw the barrel of his rifle aiming towards a glass window nearby.
There's something in there. I saw it. I don't know what it is, but it's in there.
The fear in his voice spiked. I could see by the way his feet kept shifting, he was fighting back the urge to run. My mind started buzzing at this point. I started losing touch with reality. My mind fluttered in and out. I saw things I shouldn't have seen. Children playing in the middle of the street, their faces peeling away by some unseen force. People jumping off buildings only to crawl back inside them with their broken bodies. And large piles of squirming bodies viciously ripping into each other's flesh. What set me off most, though, were their faces. They had a look of ecstasy to them. Bedroom eyes with gaping mouths moaning in delight. The more pain they received, the more they were pleasured. My eyes finally gave in and let the blackness take over. I awoke under bright artificial lights. There was a bubble of plastic around me, and my body felt broken. I glanced around and saw people dressed up in hazmat suits. They were eyeing me with clipboards in their hands. Joshua A. Jameson regained consciousness at 17:04 on the 27th of August, 1984. Muscle spasms have lessened with introduction of morphine. His eyes show movement and dilation to light. Brain function seems to have returned. I wanted to speak out, but found a lump in my throat I couldn't swallow. I let my eyes travel to the blockage and saw a large tube going through my esophagus. Even with the medications they were giving me, I couldn't let my mind escape from this place. I felt the adrenaline rush through my veins, keeping me awake. Even so, my body remained still. At this point, I began to wonder if I was paralyzed. "Joshua," I heard a familiar voice call out. "This is Dr. Hargrove. You and your team were gone for 1 minute and 58 seconds on our end. We managed to reel you in using your life support tubing. Do you remember anything?" Hargrove put on his best sympathy voice whilst hiding behind his hazmat mask. I wanted to spit on him, tell him to go to hell, and to take out my frustration and pain at his perfectly healthy frame. I began to feel my vision start to vibrate once more. I could see Hargrove look down at me with disgust before signaling to a nurse to give me more medication. Before I knew it, I was out once more. The next time I woke up, my body responded to my commands. I still felt pain, but it was manageable. This time, I was strapped down to a chair in Dr. Hargrove's office. "I'm glad to see you're awake, Jameson. Sorry about our previous meeting. I was just a little overzealous for answers. We're confident your condition has improved since then. So tell me, do you remember what happened?" I struggled to talk, but felt a stabbing pain in my neck. The hole they cut into my throat was still healing. No, please don't explain. I'd just like simple replies, as in yes or no. Raise your fingers on your right hand if yes, and your left if no. Understood? I struggled to raise the fingers on my right hand. I felt them crackle and pop under my skin. They felt unused and weak. Alright, Joshua. So, back to my first question. Do you? I cut him off and raised my left hand fingers. Okay, I'll keep note of that. Do you know what happened to your team? I raised my fingers on my left side again. Thank you, Joshua. I want to see if it's possible to kick your memory back into action. We have the video recording of what happened out there. And if by the end of it, you remember anything, just let me know. Hargrove gave a thin-lipped smile before walking over to a television set. He produced a rather large DVD and put it into a video player. I know to most of you, that didn't seem like a big deal. But this was the 80s. DVDs didn't officially exist at this point. We went ahead and cut out most of the footage that we deemed not necessary. So, let's begin when you entered the city and lost consciousness. The doctor hit the play button, and the video started. Immediately, I heard my own voice.
Did you guys say something?
My voice called out to my squad. As I watched the recording, I noted my movements were more rapid than I remembered. I'd jump from one thing to the next in a fraction of a second. Eventually, I looked back to my partners, and they shook their heads in response. I began to walk a few more feet before stopping again and crying out to my group.
Hey, stop walking. I know I heard something.
I saw the camera jump as I lurched myself forward, raising my weapon close to eye level. The video quickly shifts back and forth between me looking at the rooftops and the nearby buildings. I mouthed the next few words spoken by Bobby.
Jameson, by your feet.
The video aimed towards the red sand by my feet. The talon marks still showed up on video, which brought a faint feeling of relief to me as I continued watching. A loud bang knocked that relief away as Georgie fired off his round. I looked at him as he pointed with his rifle towards the glass windows nearby. I looked closely at the footage and swear the shadow inside that building was moving. And by shadow, I mean every damned inch of it. A hulking mass of void blocked out any of the light from reaching inside. At this point, the camera begins to wobble back and forth as my feet begin to lose any sense of sturdiness beneath them. I collapsed down to one knee and started to breathe in and out heavily.
Jameson, are you alright?
Yoshi asked, rushing over to me. I looked up at him and nodded. From here on out, I don't remember a thing.
Yeah, I'm fine. Let's keep going.
The voice was definitely me, but I most certainly had no recollection of saying it. From there, the footage sped up, the only sounds coming through being my loud, labored breaths. Every once in a while, my vision would aim towards the sand, exposing more strange footprints. Some just seemed to appear around me. Eventually, my team and I found ourselves standing near the entrance to the skyscraper.
You ready to head in, guys?
Bobby asked as he tilted his head upwards at the top of the high-rise.
Let's just get in and get out. If it's not in here, I say we call it quits for the day.
Georgie replied. In the footage, I began laughing before shaking my head. I felt a growing tension rising in my body. I might not remember much, but I knew something was about to happen.
What about these?
I said as I pointed down to our life support cables.
Dr. Hargrove said we have about an hour without them in which we can move around and explore.
I looked at Yoshi and saw the reflection of my face in his visor. I was grinning.
Alright, we'll take them off and head up.
Georgie said as he loosened his tube. The others followed suit. The camera panned down and showed me undoing the cables on my back. But there was something wrong. Right near the small of my back was a tear in the fabric. I had been completely compromised. After we undid our tethers, we entered the building. It seemed simple enough. It was just a dark lobby with a place for a secretary in a large lounge area. We moved past the desk before reaching the stairs leading upwards.
If there's no way we can walk up to the top with all of our gear on, not under an hour at least.
I said to the group.
Maybe there's another way.
We walked back near the entrance before spotting two small elevators.
There's no way in hell those are going to work.
Georgie said as we walked towards them. I heard a snicker come from my mouth before my hand reached out to the call elevator button. With a ding, the doors opened, revealing two small elevator cabins.
I don't believe this.
Bobby mumbled under his breath. I motioned for the group to get together.
We'll start at the top and make our way down. If the doctor isn't up there, we might be able to see him through the top windows. It also looks like we're going to have to split off for a bit. Barbara and Georgie, you take the elevator to the right. Me and Yoshi on the left. We'll meet on the top floor.
The crew nodded, their faces showing nothing but trust in my leadership. Please, stop this, Hargrove. I squeaked out, pain filling my throat. No more. Please. Hargrove looked over at me with false pity on his face. Are you remembering, Joshua? He asked. I wanted to say no, but things were starting to come back. Meanwhile, the footage kept rolling. Bobby and Georgie squeezed into the elevator next to ours, while Yoshi squeezed in with me. I heard the elevator next to us click shut before my gaze turned over to Yoshi.
Are we going, Jameson?
He asked. There was confusion in his eyes. Once again, I saw my face in his visor. I had an animalistic grin taking over my features. I reached for my rifle as Yoshi pressed himself against the elevator walls. With one swing, I stroked the butt of my rifle to his face, breaking the pressurized glass shielding and impaling shards through his skull. He crumpled down at my feet, clearly unconscious but not dead. I stared down at his collapsed form and swung my rifle around. I prayed that I'd just shoot him and that would be it. But I knew better. I took my rifle and began jamming the barrel repeatedly through Yoshi's face, each thrust causing me to grunt and yell, as if this was somehow Yoshi's fault. Once I was confident in my handiwork, I lifted the barrel of my gun to my face and gave a labored and hefty laugh as his flash dripped down the metal of the rifle. Soon after, I dragged his body out into the lobby, pulling a chunk of reinforced glass out of the hamburger that made off his head. I then walked out to the life support tethers and began to cut each one apart. How I managed that feat leaves my mind boggled. They had hundreds of pounds worth of strength applied to them. Even a gorilla wouldn't be able to cut them into shreds like I had been able to. After a few brief minutes, that deed was done, and I stood up gasping for breath and laughing. The only cable left untouched was mine. I turned back towards the lobby and entered the bloody elevator. I pressed the button to the second to last floor. As soon as I arrived, I launched my rifle through the elevator controls and began walking towards the staircase. Very faintly, I could hear Georgie calling out for Yoshi and me.
Hey, you guys alright? We saw the elevator stop the floor too early. Yeah, I don't like this.
I yelled back up to him.
We could use an extra weapon down here. Have Bobby provide cover at the top of the stairs, and come down here and meet with us. Roger that.
Georgie said. I felt my stomach lurch. I begged Hargrove to stop the video, but he refused. I heard Georgie's footsteps quickly descend the staircase. I positioned myself behind the entryway as not to be seen. Georgie walked right by me and never had the chance to defend himself. The shard of glass I used to cut the tethers found itself in the back of Georgie's spine. He collapsed hard against the floor and struggled to breathe. I took the glass from his back before gripping his rifle. I positioned the top of the barrel against the small wound affixed to his spine and pressed down. I could hear the sound of Georgie's spine being crushed under the metal. His body began to spasm with more force I applied. Eventually, the rifle hit the spot with no resistance and pressed straight down through his sternum and into the floor. He stopped moving.
One more.
I kept moaning to myself in the recording. I felt disgusted. It sounded as though pure sexual ecstasy was washing over me and left me sounding as though I was on the brink of rapture. I walked towards the staircase and began sprinting up them. Bobby turned to face me and saw the blood on my suit. He immediately raised his weapon and took a shot. Had this been during normal operations, he would have just killed his comrade. But something told me that Bobby knew something was wrong. I landed flat on my back and began laughing with lustful energy. I lifted my head up and began to fondle the bullet hole in my chest.
Come on, Bobby. At least make sure you kill me.
I slid up to my knees and heard the popping noises of rounds going off. My white suit now drenched in my own blood after round pierced to my body. I craned my neck and looked at my friend. He had emptied his clip on me and was trying to reload.
Do you see them, Bobby?
I asked in a sing-song tone.
They're all around us. Cutting, stabbing, hurting and loving. Pure emotions. Pure raw fucking emotions.
I began to get to my feet, blood pouring out of my wounds.
I'll make you see them, Bobby. I'll make you see paradise.
I reached over to a desk and flung it with inhuman strength towards him, knocking Bobby to the floor.
Breathe, Bobby. Breathe.
I slurred out as I stumbled towards him. While he writhed on the ground, I lifted up my boot and smashed his visor along with his nose.
10 minutes, Bobby. That's all I ask. 10 minutes. Breathe in and out.
Bobby lay nearly comatose near my feet, but I could see his suit rise and fall with his breath. Once more, the film speeds up. It shows me staring at Bobby and swaying back and forth. After about 10 minutes, Bobby's eyes open with a certain feral fear to them.
Shh. Just look, Bobby.
I I grabbed the suit and dragged him towards the window, breaking it down with my fists. Glass fell against my suit, ripping it open along with me.
Do you see them? A city full of people getting the most pleasure any of us could ever imagine. Fuck God. Fuck the devil. This is true paradise.
My hands reached out and lifted Bobby up towards the window. His eyes widened as he saw things we couldn't see on camera.
Come on, Bobby. It's time.
I struggled out a laugh as my hands shoved Bobby out of the window and let go. A few seconds passed before a loud thud echoed over the empty city.
My turn now. Then your turn, Hargrove.
I choked out another laugh before launching off the skyrise and hitting the ground. That's where the footage stops. I stared at the black screen for a while, with tears running down my face. I killed Bobby, Georgie, and Yoshi. I killed them for no reason, and I couldn't even remember doing it to them. They deserve to be remembered. Hargrove asked me a series of questions, all fairly standard, and most I didn't have a reply to. I knew exactly what happened, but couldn't conjure up to how or why. The biggest question Hargrove had was, how did I not only survive that fall, but also tether myself back up to the life support line? I wish I had an answer for him, but I don't. He asked if it could have been Dr. Carter. Once again, all I could reply with was, I don't know. At this point, most stories would end with the big bad government killing me to keep things quiet. But they didn't. They gave me a cushy job dealing with paperwork. They listed my injuries as standard wartime trauma. I was paralyzed from the waist down from one of Bobby's shots. Every time I look down at my wheelchair, it reminds me of him. The only reason they keep me alive is so I can be observed daily for any side effects of my trip. I heard Camp Hero was eventually shut down. Some people say some kid conjured up a monster back in time or something. Maybe. I don't know. It wasn't my job to know. I do believe, however, our experiment put a nail in the coffin for that place. Though, I have no idea what happened after I left. I'd imagine Dr. Hargrove gave his speech at the doorway labeled Sub-Project 23 to a group of new guards that never heard about my team and I. And once Hargrove opens the door for them, they're greeted by a new Dr. Carter, who's bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, and ready to explore. Fuck them for messing with things they shouldn't have. And fuck them for wanting me to be a part of it. Joshua A. Jameson. We've located Dr. Carter. Would you like to help us retrieve him? With regards, Dr. Grant Hargrove, Director of Sub-Project 23. That's all the email said. That's all it needed to say. I retired from the armed services in 1998. But not a day has gone by that my mind hasn't returned to the concrete crypt of Camp Hero. And not a day has gone by where I haven't tried to scrub the innocent blood off of my hands. But the truth is that all the water in the world couldn't wash them clean. I scrub and scrub, but the blue water turns red under my touch. Red like that terrible place. Red like the sands of that furthest hell. Yet, when I read that letter, I felt something. For the first time in over 40 years, I felt myself become present. When and where? I replied. And then I waited. For the last 40 years, I had lived immobile. My injuries had rendered my legs useless. I was confined to the steel charity of my wheelchair. A charity that allowed me to move about my accursed life with restricted freedom. They say God blesses the worst of us so that we can return to His light. And He might have forgiven me, but I haven't forgiven myself. I don't know if that makes me ungrateful or just a sinner. I just knew that the gift of salvation wasn't for me. Not yet. Sometime after our initial emails, a meeting had been scheduled. I would be meeting Dr. Hargrove right back at Camp Hero. Right back where it all started. On the government's dime, I had flown back up to New York. I met with my escorts at the airport. There were some hefty men in suits. They told me they'd take me the rest of the way to the facility and warned me that things aren't what they used to be. They were right. When we pulled up to the old entry site, we were greeted with the festering corpse of a facility that I used to know. Do not enter. Trespassers will be prosecuted signs littered the rusted fence of the old base. Yet, clear evidence of graffiti overlaid the formerly white concrete walls inside. The facility reflected its age, its corruption. I saw myself reflected in every decaying inch of it. We were brought through the security checkpoint with little opposition. Some men dressed as park rangers provided us with an escort. I say dressed as, because I couldn't tell you the last time I had seen park rangers outfitted with M4s. Doubly so while supposedly out on a standard patrol. I knew that these men were the new security police. They wore different uniforms, but had the same miserable job. Unlike us though, they had taken pride in trying to hide themselves from the public. When we arrived at the entrance of the subterranean tunnels beneath our feet, I had let out a sigh as heavy as a gravestone. Whether it be from regret or apprehension, I couldn't tell you. The building itself had a way of stealing your breath away, one way or another. And once more, those vampiric concrete doors had beckoned me to enter. My escorts parted the doors open for our descent. Their nice black suits had begun to conjure up images within my mind of dutiful undertakers, carrying their willing carcass into the deep bowels of a forgotten mausoleum. Our mock procession continued our descent downwards, far into the depths of crumbling concrete. Our path was guided by flickering yellow iridescent lights that buzzed overhead. Their sad songs were joined by the squealing melody of my old wheelchair. Every inch we progressed had conjured up vivid ghosts within my mind. I envisioned the empty halls filled with the staff from yesteryear, invisible forms of scientists and technicians hustling about with their 80s hairstyles and tightly rolled up sleeves. They appeared so very real to me in that moment. I had to wonder if my escorts could see them too. After an eternity of empty hallways and blank corridors, we had finally hit our final resting place. A room that had been stolen from my deepest memories and my most terrible nightmares. In front of me was a large metal door that I had first seen 40 years prior. The crumbling black paint had still read, Sub-Project 23. One of my escorts had typed in several numbers into a keypad nearest the door. 7 loud clicks filled the vacant concrete hallway as the magnetic seals disengaged. I expected to see a catacomb of death laid out before me. A final vault containing humanity's blunder. A lasting testament warning those not to look at our own world and think, not good enough. But instead, I was blinded by an intense white light that had poured out from the doorway. Inside were dozens of researchers hastily running back and forth. These would be the new men of our hereditary mistake. What we had birthed decades ago had given these men purpose. In the front of the far wall of this warehouse stood the same metallic pillars that I had endless nightmares about. They were both the keys in lock that separated our world from the next one over. With a single click of a button, The concrete wall that separated our reality from hell would fall away, joining the two realities in an unholy marriage. I glanced over further down the back wall and observed a massive pile of boxes. Several lab techs were jotting down an inventory of whatever equipment was stored inside. Their faces seemed grim and uncertain. Even through the artificial bright lights of Project Entryway, you could smell the air of inescapable rot around every corner. Even though they had done their best to keep this room clean from physical damnation, the effects on the human souls were present. Nevertheless, I still felt like I knew these men. I know it sounds mad, but they carried with them the same type of energy and aura that the men from yesteryear did. For just a moment, I thought I would be able to turn my head and be witness to the second coming of my old comrades, as though I would be able to see Georgie, Bobby and Yoshi prepped for my command. I could still hear their laughs somewhere deep within my mind, right underneath the sounds of their screaming. However, the resurrection I witnessed was not of my comrades, but a resurrection of something far worse. I turned my gaze towards my left. My eyes focused on the same battered metallic steps that I had remembered so long ago. I trailed my eyes up them to the same observation post that had controlled the gateway to hell itself. The very pulpit of scientific preaching and overreach. And with the pulpit comes the priest. At the top of the steps prevailed someone that had been plucked straight from my memory. A scraggly-looking scientist. A tall, frail man that looked like he hadn't aged more than 10 years. A man that had unintentionally spurred my ire. Dr. Grant Hargrove. He was giving orders to several other researchers from his little clerical rostrum from up high. His expression was as dour and damning as ever. That was until his eyes matched mine. Only then did his lips upturned into a tight, awful smile. Joshua A. Jameson, once more in the flesh. His voice had feigned the appearance of being pleasant. I trust retirement has treated you well? I turned my wheelchair to face the men that had not harmed me in the past, but the men who reminded me of the harm that I had done to others. Dr. Hargrove, it's been a while. Indeed it has. The director then turned to one of his assistants and handed him over a thick binder full of papers. Get it done, now. His eyes pierced through the man with little regard to the soul that lay underneath the lab coat. And don't forget the necessity of rationing out the equipment. We have to keep this within our budget. I felt my jaw clench down in disgust. I hated this man. I couldn't explain why, but I still blamed him for what I did. Worse yet, the lives that I had watched flicker out in my very own hands had meant nothing to him. Nothing to the greater project. The project itself had appeared to be dying of its own accord. No final act of vengeance to be had. Just financial ruin. No advancements. No memorials. Just death. So Joshua, welcome back to Sub-Project 23. A lot has changed. A lot hasn't. I've been off-site for some time dealing with other projects of mine. But we finally had a breakthrough, and I thought I'd return. I let out an exasperated sigh before I responded to the doctor. And why am I here? Because we're in the midst of a new exploratory phase. We need a new security team leader, and we're running low on funds. I felt my skin crawl at those words. New. What happened to the previous team lead you had? I asked. I felt the venom rise up in my throat. He found Dr. Carter's old video recordings. And then something found him. He didn't make it back with the tapes. And since we needed a new team lead, I thought back to you. My head began to swirl in dismissive anger. What? What found him? I shook my head in absolute disgust. Actually, no. You told me that you found Dr. Carter's body. I'm not here for any tapes. Wrong, Mr. Jameson. Dr. Hargrove had droned out emotionlessly. I told you that we found Dr. Carter. I didn't say anything about a body. The last team lead's footage revealed what appears to be Dr. Carter. Alive. I felt a lump in my throat. I swallowed hard. Excuse me? I know you're not daft, Mr. Jameson. You're looking upon the face of a man much younger than yourself. Why is that? Because we've begun to find some uses for the red mineral sands. In proper doses, it can slow aging to a reasonable level with minimal side effects. He paused for just a second. In major doses, it stops aging completely. It can even prevent the effects of major trauma from realizing itself. But the side effects are not pleasant in large doses. There was an immediate silence between us. The sounds of busy technicians faded away to the blaring waves of my own thoughts. If Dr. Carter was still alive, he would have been in that hellscape for hundreds, if not thousands of years. You know I'm disabled, right? Not to mention, I'm in my 60s. How can I lead a team? Simple. One of our changes involves setting up a forward outpost on the other side of the entryway. It'll allow instant transmissions of video and audio. You will lead a team of 3 men via audio and visual recording while stationed at the outpost. I stayed silent. The idea of sending men deeper into that world tugged at my heartstrings. I thought back to the recordings that Dr. Hargrove had forced me to relive. Could I put myself through something similar again? Well, Joshua, Dr. Hargrove interrupted. He was quickly becoming bored of our conversation. My brain rationalized itself to me. This time would be different. I would be able to speak to the recordings, to change the outcome. This time I would be able to lead my team back to safety. I'll do it, I mumbled, my back leaning deeper into my chair. Who will I lead? Dr. Hargrove's features changed into that of a proud father's. A genuine smile crossed his lips, but the aura of death had still lingered in his eyes. Your old squadron, Squadron 0823. They consist of the 3 surviving members from our most recent expedition. They're expecting you in your old common room. I suspect you still remember where that is. I nodded in response. Good, called out the doctor. We're leaving tomorrow morning. Now, if you'll excuse me. Without a second glance, Dr. Hargrove turned his back towards me. I took a deep breath and contemplated everything that had just happened. My head was spinning. I had felt like I had fallen off of the edge into insanity. My escorts eventually grabbed onto the back of my wheelchair and broke me from my trance. He began to push me back out of the lab. I stopped him and took in a deep breath. Thanks for everything. But let me do this. If you could just get the door for me. The tall man nodded and entered in the exit code. The heavy magnetized door swung back open. I wheeled myself out into the concrete maze of decaying hallways and empty rooms. I followed the specter of my memories towards the old common room. I couldn't help but reminisce over the fact that the last time I had ventured into those depths, I had stood tall and confident. I felt frail and weak. The ceilings had towered over my body like a hellish giant. They loomed over me with no regard over who I was. They judged me over every rotation of my wheels, and over every labored breath I took. It was in that moment that I felt the same energy that I had always felt down there. The feeling of absolute isolation. It wasn't until I heard the solemn sounds of voices echoing through the empty corridors that I was able to remind myself that I wasn't alone. I could feel the muscles in my heart tense up from my nerves. I kept asking myself if I was ready for this. I kept telling myself, you have to be. It wasn't until I approached the only illuminated room in the otherwise desolate passageway that I was able to understand the voices in the air. The first voice I had heard displayed a distinguishable Irish accent. His voice had fluttered its way out of the room further than the other ones could, I don't know, he groaned. I don't think I'm ready to go back. A deeper, fuller voice replied back to the young Irishman. We owe it to Stevens. Swallow that fear for now. And what about? I wheeled myself into the room, interrupting the young man. 3 faces turned to face me at that moment. Not a single one blessed to see me. Oh fuck, the Irishman mumbled. I could feel the air of total disappointment take charge over the room. They gave us an old man in a wheelchair. I took a deep breath before introducing myself. Yeah, they did, and also assigned me as the team leader. So, we can work together, or die together. Your choice. The Irishman shrugged and took a sip of his drink. Suppose we'll work together then. I wheeled myself up to their table and extended my hand to the 3 of them. Each one shook it. Each of them had a strong, dependable grip. Good to meet you all. My name's Joshua A. Jameson, former Air Force pararescue. Retired as a Chief Master Sergeant after 20 years. More importantly, I've been to the same hell as all of you. Hargrove said you'd have some experience out there, the man of considerable size remarked. His skin was dark and scarred, but there was warmth in his eyes. My name's Henry Adams, former Army Ranger. Spent 20 years in, got out and started contract work. I looked over to the Irishman, who was continuously adjusting himself in his seat. He appeared to have a hard time just sitting still. I noted that his red hair was neatly trimmed along the sides and swept over on the top. His eyes were a crystal clear shade of blue. I'm Timothy Doyle, but you can call me Tim. It's good to meet you. I'm also a former Ranger, but with the Irish Defence Force, born and raised in Galway. Tim flashed a smile, showcasing his pearly white teeth. That's when I turned my view over to our last team member. A man with short black hair and a hardened gaze. Clark Miller, former Marine Recon, current contractor. I kept my eyes on him. I could tell he wasn't telling the whole truth. He was too young to have retired from the Marine Corps, and too orderly to have resigned without a plan. Did you do anything after the Marines? I probed. He was quiet for a moment, then finally showed a small smirk. Yeah, CIA. Clark seemed to relax his shoulders for just a moment. At least until he heard Tim's voice directed towards his person. No shit, you were with the CIA? I've known you almost a full year now, and you didn't mention that? Tim laughed at himself before leaning over towards Clark. Clark just grunted in response. He had closed his eyes like a vice grip and stayed still, the only sign of life within him being that of a throbbing vein irritatedly pumping blood in his neck. I cleared my throat to reel the man back in. Listen, I'm not up to date on anything, so fill me in. Does the entryway still take you to the middle of nowhere with a big unfinished city on the horizon? Henry spoke up. Unfinished? That city is all there is. It's like an endless maze of streets and alleyways. Yeah, we go through it, set up a forward post, then conduct our missions. Clark explained. Us 4. Clark paused for just a moment. Us 3 have done it about 12 times together. We replaced the last group that got cycled out. Tim air quoted Clark's words. Cycled out. Yeah, right. If there was an issue with their life support equipment, they all went nuts. He let out a sarcastic sigh. We've been lucky this far. If it wasn't for the pay, it wouldn't be worth the hassle. Henry interrupted Tim's disillusioned rant. Hey Chief, how are you going to lead us with your disability? I replied. Apparently, I'm going to stay at the base camp and guide you all from some console. A silence fell on the group. Being down a man is going to be a liability, Clark flatly stated to the table of men. He opened his eyes back up and stared at me like a hawk with its talons fully extended. I agree, but I'll do what I can for you. I've got experience that the other eggheads don't have. I also happen to value life more than some old recordings. Tim laughed and clapped his hands together. Hell yeah, that'll be a breath of fresh air. Hargrove's always on us about ending missions early, even when things get weird. I squinted my eyes towards the red-headed Irishman. Weird? Like what kind of weird? What's not weird about that place? Henry muttered, taking a sip of his water. The voices, the screams, the shadows. He paused, and the hair on his forearm crept up. I really hate that place. There was a silence. I nodded. Me too, I whispered. The next few hours we spent getting to know one another. Henry had grown up in Arizona. He had always wanted to be a ranger and made sure that dream came true. Afterwards, he tried to be a family man, but could never find the one that forced him to settle down. So, he returned back to the world of conflict and contracting. He nearly died overseas a few times, but always managed to pull himself through. Tim, on the other hand, had never had any idea what he wanted to do. He thought having a uniform would be fun and figured having the chance to travel outside of Ireland would be a blast. Instead, he got stationed in his own country. He made it his mission to collect enough negative paperwork that no one wanted him re-enlisting. Afterwards, he gave being a paramedic a shot, but he ended up getting bored again. His latest change in life led him to being involved with contract work. And finally, there was Clark. He didn't have much to tell us. He had some distinguished awards from the Marine Corps. Then he felt a calling for governmental work, but couldn't give up his gun. So, he thought the CIA would fit him nicely. Unfortunately for him, not everyone's an agent. He got stuck pushing paperwork. So, he left. He found the same contract group as the others and signed his name on the dotted line. That night, we had all sauntered out of the meeting feeling a little bit more refreshed. When we all left for our separate rooms, I finally felt an ounce of peace and clarity. For the first time in decades, I closed my eyes and prayed. God in heaven, hear my prayer. Help me, so I might help others. Let not my hand cause harm to my allies, but deal death to the wicked. Guide me through your spirit as I venture into the depths of hell. Amen. I took a deep breath and wheeled myself over to my cot. The blankets and pillows were clearly dusty and old. I let out a small chuckle. I realized that Dr. Hargrove had never thought of the amenities that someone would need in order to be content in a workplace. Pillows and blankets were beyond him. I lurched myself up and swung my body over the edge of the bed. I rested my head on the firm pillow beneath me. Sleep, I prayed. And for the first time in decades, I slept. That morning had come faster than I had expected. My alarm abruptly launched me out of my blackened and empty dreams. The red glow of its illuminated numbering was the only light within that sunless room. It forced me to be reminded of the fact that nothing but dozens of layers of soil lay over the tops of our heads, and endless miles of soil below us. As long as man lay without light, he is nothing more than a ghoul. I thought to myself as I hit my alarms button and started off my day. Before I knew it, we were all back in that accursed concrete warehouse that contained Sub-Project 23. Good morning, everyone. Our expedition will be commencing soon. Dr. Hargrove's voice rang out over the large, barren room full of tireless staff members. Reminder, Group 1 will leave in exactly 30 minutes. Group 2 will leave exactly 6 seconds after them. No mistakes today. And with that, the preparations went into full effect. Group 1 was full of the builders. the lab techs that would be bringing out our supplies to create our forward outpost. They'd be setting up base camp, while us, the exploratory team, were on the other side of the portal. What would be an hour for them would only consist of 6 seconds for us. At that time, we'd push through. I would take control of the comm system. Meanwhile, my team would move up to the last known coordinates of Stevens and Carter. Several technicians helped my team suit up in our lightweight gear. A thin veil of fabric would end up being our only protection from the horrors that awaited us on the other side of the entryway. But no amount of gear could keep us away from the horrors that lay within our own imaginations. I groaned and called out to the others while being suited up. You guys got lucky. In my day, you could barely scratch your ass while you're in your suit. Tim laughed. Listen to this old man, telling us how hard he had it back in his day. I looked over to Tim and mustered up the most sarcastic smile I could. He leaned over in a mocking rendition of an elderly man, his arms and legs shaking. The moment he turned to face me, I raised up one very important finger towards him, just in time for the researchers to seal my helmet over my head. After a few moments of my own heavy breathing, I heard a voice come over our internal radios.
Checking.
Clark called out. The crisp audio filled up the empty dome of my helmet like a blaring gong.
Loud and clear,
Henry replied. He paused for a moment.
Let's find Stevens today. He deserves that much at least.
Tim murmured to himself.
And Dr. Carter. He's been through enough.
I added in modestly. At the end of my words, Dr. Hargrove's toneless voice came over the loudspeaker.
Attention. The entryway is about to be activated. All staff, don your ear protection.
Several workers put foam earbuds in their ears. A few of them turned their backs towards the machine.
Lab is clear,
Dr. Hargrove stated, before flipping a switch. With a loud click, the whirlwind of machinery began to whir to life. The portal began to open. The back wall fell apart into the inky darkness of the same void that had filled my nightmares for the last few decades. A void that I never thought I'd see again. I felt my stomach turn. Seeing the impossible swirling of empty matter was something man was never meant to view. Every ounce of your being told you that what it was wrong.
Group 1, prepare for departure.
A large line of technicians carrying boxes and gears stepped up to the entryway. One of them turned towards the observation post and raised their thumbs up in the air. Dr. Hargrove returned the gesture.
Group 2, prepare for departure.
I twisted myself around and faced Dr. Hargrove, extending the same motion towards him. He nodded, and I spun back around towards the gate.
In 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, depart.
With that, all of the men online pressed through the portal at the same moment. A sickening, sucking noise filled the room. Tim, Clark, Henry, and I took their places in front of the portal. Hargrove had already begun the 6-second countdown for us.
Ready?
I called out.
Ready. Aye. Let's go.
Depart.
With those words, we stepped through the entryway. The void birthed us on the other side. My stomach turned and I swallowed burning bile. Breathe, I kept telling myself. Breathe. The landscape had changed completely from the last time I had been there. In every direction, there were towering skyscrapers and endless building complexes. Empty streets with billowing gusts of red sands stretched as far as the eye could see. The only thing that had carried over from our reality was the temporary science outpost that the first group had set up. Colossal industrial lights billowed their lights down upon the tents. Each tent was filled with computers and research equipment. Several other lights had also faced outwards, towards all the surrounding alleyways and streets. voice called out through our headsets.
Auxiliary personnel may now leave the area.
A large group of technicians walked back towards the entryway and stepped back through it, exiting the way they came.
Why are they leaving?
I asked my team. Henry replied in a solemn tone.
The shadows out here have never killed anyone. Well, not that we know of, but the techs have. More bodies out here means more liabilities.
He took a deep breath before continuing.
So, you'll be here with the skeleton crew, Chief. Stay safe.
I nodded. I had to wonder how many researchers had lost their lives out here.
I understand. Same goes for all of you. I want to hear about every step you take. Roger that.
Henry acknowledged. Meanwhile, Tim let loose a quick whistle before chiming in.
That's a lot of steps.
Clark immediately interrupted the group.
Henry, are you still in charge of the coordinates?
Henry nodded and pulled out his tablet. A city map littered its screen.
Looks like it'll be 15 blocks north, 17 blocks west. Fucking hell.
Tim moaned.
Seemed a lot closer last time we were here. Just keep your guard up.
Clark said, his rifle aimed upward towards the rooftops adjacent to us.
Alright everyone, we heard Tim. It's a long walk, so let's move.
Henry took a step towards their objective. The others followed suit. I turned myself towards a small desk surrounded by clear plastic sheeting. A computer with several monitors was set up inside.
All yours, sir.
One of the techs called out.
Do you need any help getting there?
I looked down at the wheels under me. Rat sand had wrapped themselves around the metal spokes like tendrils.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
I replied. The man quickly rushed over to me and helped me move towards my station.
Actually, I have a question for you. Shoot.
The young tech said.
Why do you guys not just set up inside the buildings? If there's less wind in them, there's gotta be less sand too.
The man laughed uncomfortably and shook his head.
It's more dangerous. You're not alone in those buildings. Hell, you're barely alone out here.
I lowered my head and contemplated what he had said. Without another word, he had effortlessly unzipped the plastic sheeting around my new home and guided me inside.
Thanks.
I tried my best to smile at the man.
No problem. It's already all set up for you. Just click on the person you want to view. It'll pop up some live footage. If you want to speak with them, you can click the transmitter button. It's good for long distances. Once they get closer to camp, they'll be able to talk through your headset again. Got it.
I wheeled myself up to my desk and began to take account of my surroundings. The young tech zipped my tent back up and carried himself back to his duties. The monitor showed a list of 3 names. Right next to them displayed a mock-up of the currently charted city streets. A large red drop pin showed the objective's location. No GPS was available to us. It would be up to me to manually keep track of the location of my men. I dragged my cursor over towards Clark's name and double-clicked. A small window of a live recording began to play. Tim's voice crackled over the speakers in the tent.
I fucking hate that noise.
Tim mumbled. His voice carried with it none of its usual sarcasm. For the first time since I came out of the portal, I became aware of the noises around me. Loud, lamenting moans called out from every nearby building and from every nearby floor. They reverberated within my ears, cutting through my helmet. There were no words, just pained ecstasy. The multitude of different voices blended together into a cacophonous wind, a flurry of sounds that carried with it the torment of hundreds.
Push past it.
Clark quipped back, not just bringing Tim back to task, but also myself.
Mission first, bullshit second. Easy for you to say, Mr. Spook.
Tim said as he scanned nearby windows. The men continued their ceaseless walking down those desolate streets. Every now and then, flashes of vehicle reflectors could be seen shining through the dust. A small reminder that this world was a mockery of our own.
Can you read me?
I called out, using the button next to my terminal.
Jesus.
Tim muttered out in surprise.
Yeah, we read you.
Clark replied.
We're 4 blocks north of camp.
With that, I moved their drop pins 4 blocks north on my map. I looked outside of my little clear plastic haven towards the buildings that towered over me. Like the vehicle reflectors on the roads, the earthly brick and mortar bodies of the buildings had cast an uncanny chill down my spine. I glanced up towards what we would have considered the heavens. Yet, the sky here was blotted out by a bright vortex of red sand. I could only wonder what the sun beyond the mist must look like. As I was returning my eyes to my monitor, I quickly caught a flash of something in a nearby window. For just a moment, it appeared like a living black mass had pushed against the glass. I kept staring, but couldn't make anything out. In the end, I ignored it. That's all I could do. There were a handful of other technicians that could handle the unnatural monstrosities around base camp. My job was to handle the monstrosities that appeared around my own men. With that, I diligently marked down every block that they walked through. Every noise that they heard, I took note of. Though the situation was tense, things were going relatively smoothly. As I was switching to Clark's camera, I saw Henry freeze up, his body suspended mid-step.
Did you guys hear that?
The large man said, his head darting rapidly from side to side.
Hear what?
Clark asked, quickly turning around to cover their rear.
Something about a cut.
Henry whispered over the radio. I felt my heart jump. I immediately lurched into action. I switched over my camera view towards Henry.
Henry, look down at your feet right now.
His field of vision quickly shifted downward. Around them were large footprints in the sand of taloned claws.
What the fuck is that?
Henry asked, backing away slowly from the track marks. I swallowed my panic hard.
Tim, check Henry for any cuts in his suit. Clark, provide overwatch.
Each of my teammates dutifully followed my orders. Tim hurried over to Henry and immediately began doing an inspection of his suit. Clark hastily shifted his body around to maintain some sort of scene security. That's when the screaming of the city stopped, and all I heard was silence. Why was it quiet? I thought to myself. Had I gone deaf? I could still hear the sounds of the plastic walls ripping and crackling around me. I shook my head in genuine fear. Tim's voice broke my focus.
I found something.
Tim called out. He opened up his supply bag and pulled out a thick piece of medical tape to cover the hole with.
How did you know there was a tear? That's how it got me,
I said, my voice trailing off and my finger far from the intercom. Almost immediately, a shot rang out. Henry turned towards Clark. Clark's hands were still on his rifle, but his legs were shaking.
Sir, I saw something. Well, I didn't see anything. They were just popping up in the sand.
His voice filtered away.
Listen, you all move forward. But if anyone hears anything, sees anything, you stop, you examine and take your time. We're our own worst enemies out here.
Clark took a hand off of his rifle and pinched his thigh. His legs tightened up underneath his grip.
Aye, sir,
he said.
Listen, if Henry's good, just keep moving.
I replied. Tim stood up and put his tape away. Henry took in some deep and heavy breaths to test his filter.
Everything's looking good now, Chief. Let's go.
Henry said with a hollow-hearted determination. And together, they pressed forward. The silence around us was all-consuming. It was almost as though the very world commanded the city to be quiet. Whereas God had given us His word, whatever was out here had stripped it from us.
17 blocks west.
Henry called out, staring down at his tablet.
Then, we're at our destination.
I updated their location again. I gave a slow inspection of the world outside. I needed to give my eyes a break from the bright glow of my monitor for just a moment. I couldn't help but notice that all the devouring sands seems to be getting darker. The typical dull red colors were melding away into a deep crimson midnight. Whatever light source lay beyond those dusty red clouds was quickly fading away.
Turn on your headlights.
I ordered. Each of them responded by clicking a little button on the side of their visors. The three of their lights attacked the encroaching darkness surrounding them like a hot knife through butter. But even with that fierce cone of light, we could barely see past the flurry of darkened sands. I would only be able to see what God would allow me to see through those cameras. I prayed it would be enough. Yet still, my team just kept venturing forward. They no longer cracked jokes or quips back at each other. They treated the darkness like a beast that we hadn't yet seen. They focused entirely on their surroundings with little deviation. All I could do was watch them through my monitor. I'd watch their heads turned to clear out any alleys they passed. I'd see things in those empty back streets. Things I wasn't sure that anyone else could see. Things I was too afraid to ask about. But the one thing I could be sure of was that every time they had turned around, the encroaching darkness was just a little bit closer. A little bit darker.
6 blocks left.
Henry called out to the others. The shadows of the sands engulfed the city around them. Between the dust and the night sky, almost nothing could be seen. I thought about how in this vast expanse of a city, there were only 4 lights, each one shining like a beacon in this empty void. 3 tiny little mobile specks of illumination, and 1 large stationary beacon. I felt a chill rush over me at that thought. And for just a moment, I was thankful for the sand. It cloaked the darkness, sure, but it also obscured us from the darkest depths of this new hell.
Target up ahead.
Clark called out. His voice shook me from my thoughts. I switched to his camera and watched as he aimed his rifle straight down the vacant street. Laying in the middle of the lane was an ancient body, half covered with dust and wearing a grizzled suit. A suit that looked just like ours.
It's Stevens.
Henry murmured.
Stay focused.
I called out to the 3.
Be alert. Stevens got ambushed in this exact spot. Let's not turn out like him.
Steadily, our team moved forward, each of their steps being muffled out by the dust underneath their feet. They slowly swept through the area with their lights. I bounced back and forth from all 3 of their perspectives.
Tim, check Stevens for the recordings. Clark, Henry, keep overwatch.
Tim pressed forward to Stevens' decaying body. He dropped down to one knee right next to the corpse. The other 2 men had formed the 2-man perimeter around their fallen comrade. It only took a moment of silence for Tim to discover something.
Fuck.
Tim muttered.
Guys, Stevens' suit is empty. There's nothing inside of it.
My heart tensed up.
Keep looking for the recordings.
I tried to remain in control, but my voice betrayed me. I watched as Tim dove back through the dead man's gear.
Something's wrong.
Clark whispered.
I can feel something watching us.
My hair stood on end. I felt it too. It felt like a predatory gaze. I tore my eyes from my computer and realized that my surroundings had changed. I was caught sitting inside of a lit-up plastic coffin. All around me was surrounded by an unpierceable black void. It felt as if I was floating in an empty abyss. All of the lights outside of my tent had been extinguished. Or worse, consumed. My heart beat louder and louder in my chest. I could feel the vibration from its drumming right beneath my sternum. I quickly reached out towards a flashlight near my monitor and prayed that it would work. With a quick flick of a button, the flashlight ignited. The small beam of light spilled out a steady stream of illumination. I shone the device through the plastic wall of my former haven. I aimed it straight down the alley right in front of me. I gasped as my light hit something. 3 ominous figures stood down the empty funnel of buildings. 3 figures that were all donning the antiquated suits of my former team members. I tried to tear my eyes away from them, but I couldn't. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "Joshua, come here, brother. We missed you," I heard Georgie's voice say, the noise coming from within my own head. The figures began promptly floating through the empty space of the abyss towards me. Their visors reflected my light back at me with a sinister glare. Just then, just when they were a few yards from my station, a few shots sounded off from my speaker. My concentration broke. The 3 dead men disappeared back into my imagination, and the lights of the camp flooded back over me. I heard several techs behind me moving supplies.
Movement. My center.
Henry called out over my intercom. He stood crouched with practiced expertise, but his voice was shaken. I quickly clicked onto his name and saw what he had seen. Off around the side of a building were the glowing deranged eyes of a man that shouldn't be. A small, emotionless face could barely be seen peeking past the corner of the building's brickwork. His features scarcely illuminated through the oppressive sands.
Wait.
I called out almost by reflex. A spark of resemblance hit my mind.
That's Dr. Carter.
A series of emotions peaked inside of me that I didn't know I had. The man's shimmering eyes flashed towards Henry, almost as though he had heard me speak his name. I looked at the figure more closely. The doctor wore no expression on his face. His eyes reflected a deep, visceral intensity I had never before seen on a man. I heard Henry grind his teeth together.
"Listen, Chief, something's..."
He stopped mid-sentence. The man walked around the corner of the building, fully exposing himself to our light. Behind the sandy winds lay the man I had seen decades ago. His facial structure was frozen to the exact moment that I had last seen him. His body, however, was different. He was gaunt and pale. His clothes had long since disintegrated around his thin frame. His fingernails stretched downwards like daggers, curving slightly into his bloody thighs. The doctor didn't walk towards my men. He crept. His feet were gliding weightlessly towards them. In the darkness of the night, he had the same silhouette of the shadow man that I had seen all those years ago. My speaker exploded with Tim's voice.
"Found it!"
Dr. Carter's head snapped back towards the young Irishman. In that moment, the darkness seemed to consume the old doctor. Carter took on the veil of the abyss like a rope. It surrounded him, devoured him into its fold. Not a single speck of light could pass through the black tar around him. And I watched what could only assume was his legs grow unnaturally skyward. They expanded themselves upwards, pushing his body at least half a story high. The whites of his eyes remained the only thing visible in the darkness of the sands overhead. Clark screamed out in fear and anger. Within a fraction of a second, he began firing shot after shot into Dr. Carter's elongated form. Henry immediately joined in. Dr. Carter let out a noise that I don't think I had ever heard before. It was inhumane, yet ancestral. The man turned shadow, darted down an alleyway and disappeared out of view. His long legs propelled him forward with perverted and unnatural speed.
"Retreat back to the portal, now!"
I called out over my intercom. Tim jumped from Stevens's body to join up with the others, He was only a few feet away when a looming shadow bursted out of a dark alleyway and latched itself onto his leg. Crawling out of the alleyway once again was the deformed visage of Dr. Carter.
Oh no, oh no!
Tim screamed, his voice echoing through the city's hellscape. He aimed his rifle at the man and began to pull the trigger. His frantic screams ignited the whole world alive. A chorus of screams filled the air all around us. Every inch of the city bellowed out with morbid anguish and fully indulged hedonism. The whole world joined Tim's terrified song. Clark turned around and unleashed his own burst of rounds into the infernal creature. The shade didn't react. Instead, he had picked him up impossibly high and hurled him back down to the sands below. A red cloud of dust kicked its way up into the air. My men were completely blinded. The only thing I could make out over the terminal was Tim screaming out in intense agony, and the unmistakable sounds of muscle popping and ripping from bone. My brain began to shut down. The noises of the chaos quickly hushed themselves in my mind. As I stared silently into the screen, my vision had begun to fade. "One more to take to your grave," a voice called out from within my mind. It was familiar. "Bobby? We've been here for so long, Jameson," Yoshi wailed. "We can't leave." My vision was nothing more than a blur. The darkness outside had returned in full force. This time, I felt it creep inside of my tent. I could see its tendrils wrap around my body through my damaged side. It gripped onto my face and tried to dig its way inside of my skull. "Why'd you do it? I trusted you," Georgie yelled out into my ear. "Be quiet," I yelled back. The tendrils swiftly loosened themselves at my voice. I repeated myself again and again, my voice exploding with anger. The black vines quickly retreated back out of my tent, back into my own imagination. Before I could even catch my breath, the sounds of Tim screaming quickly returned to my station. I forced myself back into action. I wiped my eyes with my shaking, sweaty hands and looked back towards the monitor. I was just in time to see the last strand of Tim's leg being torn away from his body. The living chasm of the abyss had used its long, crooked fingers to strip chunks of Tim's severed thigh free. The creature lifted the dangling meat to its shimmering white eyes in mock curiosity. Meanwhile, Henry and Clark had both noticed the same thing. Halfway between Tim and the duo lay Tim's back. Tim was close to the creature. His back, however, was not. Clark immediately ran forward and picked up the back. He had the objective in his hands.
"The recordings are in here. We have to leave,"
Clark shouted towards Henry. Henry still had his rifle aimed up towards the dark leviathan. I instantly hopped onto the intercom.
"Henry, I'm ordering you to grab Tim and bring him back home."
I felt my own regret filter out of my voice.
"Henry, now!"
I shouted. Clark immediately backed away from the creature and shook his head at Henry.
"Don't risk it."
Henry stared back at him. Tim's cries for help were slowly fading away. And with one swift motion, Henry turned towards Tim. With all the speed he could muster, he ran towards the creature. The beast turned his eyes to Henry, and the second Henry had laid his hands on Tim, the creature leaned forward. I watched through Henry's feet as the two came face to face with each other. Carter's new form loomed over Henry with an immense presence. His uncanny eyes were unmistakably predatory. But when Henry had begun to drag Tim away, Carter did nothing. The twisted man's silhouette still held onto the detached limb of our comrade. As Henry made his escape, his ghastly eyes followed Henry with every drag and pull.
"Get out of my head! Get out of my head!"
Henry shouted over the speakers.
"We're going to leave. We will!"
Henry hastily pulled out a tourniquet from his vest. His hands were shaking. He flipped Tim over and applied the medical apparatus to his leg. Tim was barely conscious, his fear and adrenaline completely exhausted.
Take him and get out of there.
I called out over the radio. Clark grunted in frustration before running over to Tim and Henry. The duo helped Tim back up to his remaining foot and carried him away. Together, they pressed forwards. Their destination was finally homebound. After a few minutes of constant progress, I let out a sigh of relief. I took a moment to place my weathered hands over my old face. I just kept on breathing. It's all I could think to do. When I finally took my hands off of my face, I still couldn't see. I opened and closed my eyelids over and over again. But my vision never came back. I could feel the cold sweat of anxiety begin to pour down from my forehead again. I was so close. We were so close. Why wasn't it over? In the darkness of my vision, I couldn't make out anything other than my own labored breath. I kept waiting for the light to come back, but it never did. After some time, I reached forward towards my desk, and my hands met with nothing. I felt an endless amount of time pass by within the depths of my own mental prison. How long was I there? I just couldn't say, but long enough that I almost gave in. But at that final moment of sanity, in that dark place I had called my mind, something finally lit me up. 3 aged, yellowed lights had shone from the inside of the darkness that lay in front of me. There stood Georgie, Bobby, and Yoshi. Their ancient headlights had lit me up like a deer in the night. "Boss, it's time to come with us," Georgie called out. "We can show you everything you've missed." A muffled voice came out from the darkness next to me. So faint, I could barely hear it.
Chief, can you give us an update on our location?
It was Henry. He sounded exhausted. His breath labored. "No, leave them," Yoshi's voice interrupted. His voice was a faint memory of the man I used to know.
Chief, can you hear us? It's getting harder to see out here.
I turned toward the voice. It felt a little clearer now. "Don't leave us again," Bobby cried out. His voice echoed with sorrow. I turned my face to my old team for one last time. I finally saw them for what they were. Their suits were broken, bloodied and torn. Their faces were pounded into unrecognizable masses. The same unrecognizable masses that I had abandoned them with all those decades ago. "You're not leaving here," Bobby's flattened and broken body commanded. "You owe us." "I do owe you, and I'll pay for it. But for right now, I have to help my team." I bit down on my tongue hard enough to rip a chunk of flesh from it. That gave me enough strength to turn away from my past guilt. I knew I had failed my last crew. I wouldn't fail this one. My world slowly came back into fruition. I was back at the monitor, hand already on the intercom.
"Give me landmarks. I'll try to find you,"
I called out to them.
"Oh, thank God."
I heard Tim's mumbled voice mutter.
"The block to our north has 4 large buildings. South has 6. East and west have 7.
Henry stated, his camera swaying back and forth in either direction. I quickly matched it up with a nearby intersection next to the objective marker.
"Okay, keep heading south. I'll guide you from there." "Aye, sir,"
Clark replied, his voice loud and clear. Block after block, I guided the man back home. The screams from the empty city never ceased. Their wails were crying out towards us like clawed hands, trying to pull us back in. Every step my men took sent a message back that we wouldn't give in, that we wouldn't listen to their dark songs any longer. Before I knew it, I saw 3 tall headlights approaching our camp from a distance. They were a block closer than I had calculated. I tried to reach out to them through my headset, but couldn't get a response. The technicians had already moved the bulk of the equipment back through the portal. My tent was the last to leave. The same tech from earlier who helped push me into my tent and guided me back out of it. We finally did it, I thought. We're finally going to get everyone back home. By the time the crew had made it to the entryway, every speck of evidence that we had been there was gone. My men quickly pushed through the empty camp straight into the portal. Not a word was spoken between us. I was the final man to leave. I turned my eyes one last time towards the dark and empty city. Just a block away in the darkness, I could see 3 bright lights shuffling their way towards me. I'll pay for what I did to you. I promise. I closed my watery eyes and wheeled myself back through the portal. Tim, Henry, and Clark didn't have much to say to anyone after the incident. Tim's leg healed quickly. He'd have to have a fake leg, but he'd make it work. All of them seemed a little different after all that happened. They were distant. Each of them said they were just ready to explore the world and to leave that hellscape behind. They all had suffered enough over there. It was time for them to move on. To be honest, I think the toll of visiting that place could wash away the strongest man's constitution. I could only pray that my mind was able to put something back in its correct place after that. And for just a moment, I thought that there might actually be a chance for me to live out my remaining life. But Dr. Hargrove had one last surprise for me. One last joke. On the eve of my departure, he had called me up into his office. "Hello, Joshua. I'd like to thank you again for retrieving Dr. Carter's recordings. They've proven to be invaluable, both to our research and to our funding." I ignored the man across from me. My initial bitter resentment had faded away into a dull pain. I just didn't have the energy to hate the doctor anymore. At least, I didn't think I did. The reason I bring this up is, well, how would you like to watch it with me? Dr. Hargrove smiled.